There are things you grow up around for so long that you stop seeing them clearly. Not because they are healthy, not because they are harmless, but because they are familiar. Sometimes chaos does not announce itself as chaos. Sometimes it sounds like family. Sometimes it sounds like love. Sometimes it sounds like raised voices at the dinner table, sharp words, loaded silence, tension in the room, and then everyone just moving along as if nothing happened. And if that's what you grew up around, you do not call it dysfunction. You call it normal. In this episode, I want to talk about what happens when intensity is what raised you. When conflict is modeled as something sharp and unresolved. When emotional unpredictability becomes familiar enough that you stop questioning it. And what it means to realize, much later, that chaos did not just happen around you, it trained you. Because children do not get to choose what feels normal. They absorb it. They adapt to it. They build themselves around it. And later, as adults, we call that personality. We call that chemistry. We call it attraction. We call that resilience. But sometimes it is conditioning. And it takes a long time to untangle the difference. Welcome to The Fan in the Window, Interrupting What We Inherit. I'm Tressa Bell. This podcast is about trauma, nervous systems, generational patterns, and the complicated, imperfect work of healing. I also talk about family systems, caregiving, and what it means to tell the truth about the stories that shaped us. It's about what gets passed down and what we can choose to interrupt. Today's episode is called When Chaos Feels Normal. Because one of the strangest parts of healing is realizing that what shaped you often didn't feel dramatic while you were living inside it. It felt familiar. It felt explainable. It felt like the way things were. And sometimes that is exactly why it takes so long to name. Before I go further, I want to say something clearly about this space. This podcast is not therapy. It is not medical advice. It is not psychological treatment. I am not your therapist. Some episodes include themes related to trauma, including family instability, self-harm threats, and other forms of emotional harm. Please listen at your own pace. If anything in this episode brings up strong feelings or memories, please take care of yourself and reach out for support. In the U.S., you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're outside the U.S., you can find international hotlines at findahelpline.com. You don't have to navigate this alone. This space is about awareness, not diagnosis. One of the most important things I've come to understand is that children normalize whatever they have to normalize in order to stay connected. They do not sit back and evaluate the emotional health of the adults around them. They do not say, "This is dysregulating. This is unsafe. This is emotionally inconsistent. This is teaching me the wrong thing about love." They live inside it. They adapt to it. They organize themselves around it. That is what children do. A child's job is not to diagnose the room. A child's job is to survive the room. And survival especially in families, often looks like normalization. This is just how she is. This is just how families fight. This is just what happens when people get stressed. This is just what marriage looks like. This is just what closeness costs. And over time, that becomes your template. There's research in developmental psychology that helps explain this. Children are wired for attachment first, not accuracy. Their nervous systems prioritize connection to caregivers over correctly interpreting what's happening, which means they will reinterpret almost anything in any way that allows them to stay connected. Even chaos, even harm, even unpredictability. Because connection is survival. Children are incredibly perceptive. They notice tone. They notice tension. They notice unpredictability. They notice who is withdrawing, who is hurt, who is dangerous, who has power, and who has none. They notice all of that. But noticing is not the same as being able to name it. And when something repeats often enough, it stops feeling unusual. We do not just remember our childhoods. We are patterned by them. And some of those patterns are not obvious until much later when we begin to ask ourselves why certain things felt familiar, even when they hurt. There is one memory I have come back to because it captures this so clearly. We were sitting at the dinner table. My children were there. My mother was there. Thomas was there. Something had upset her. I do not even remember what started it. What I remember is the way the room changed. And then she looked at him and said she hoped he would choke on his chicken. That sentence has stayed with me. Not because it was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Not because it was the most dramatic moment of my childhood or adulthood, but because of how sharp it was. How casually cruel. How suddenly the air changed in the room. I remember the silence after. I remember the embarrassment. I remember feeling protective of my children and of him. I remember knowing they were watching. And what stands out to me now is not only what she said, it's at the time I did not fully register it as harmful in the way I would now. I knew it was ugly. I knew it was uncomfortable. I knew it was not okay. But on some deeper level, it also fit inside something I already understood. Intensity. Humiliation. Words used like weapons. Conflict that cut through the room and left everyone else holding it. It was familiar enough that part of me moved immediately into management mode instead of clarity. That matters, because that is what normalization does. It does not necessarily make you fail to feel the discomfort. It makes you fail to fully trust what the discomfort means. You feel the sting. You feel the tension. You feel the shift. But instead of saying, "This is profoundly unhealthy," you say, "This is how she is." And that is a very different thing. I think one of the deepest things I inherited was not just pain, but a model. A model of conflict. A model of emotional life. A model of what it meant to be close to someone. And the model was often this: intensity first, repair later, or not at all. Words were said that could not be unsaid. Energy filled the room. Everybody felt it. Everybody adjusted. And then life kept moving. But movement is not repair. Silence is not repair. Time is not repair. Pretending it didn't happen is not repair. Being used to it is not repair. And yet, when that is what you have seen over and over, you can grow up believing conflict is simply supposed to feel damaging. That relationships are inherently destabilizing. That love includes emotional shrapnel. That closeness means impact. That the goal is not mutual safety, but endurance. I did not know then how much my children learn by watching adults fight. Not just from the content of the argument, but from the structure of it. What happens when someone is angry? What happens when someone is hurt? Does anyone come back? Does anyone apologize? Does anyone name what happened? Does anyone protect the children in the room from becoming emotional witnesses to adult volatility? Those are the lessons. And children absorb them long before they can explain them. I think this is one of the reasons people stay confused for so long about their own histories. Because we often imagine harm as something obvious. We imagine it announcing itself clearly. We imagine ourselves recognizing it in real time. We imagine that if something was damaging enough to matter, surely we would have known. But that is not how it works. Not always. Sometimes harm is woven into ordinary life so tightly that it does not stand out. It is not a single dramatic event. It's a tone, a pattern, a repetition, a room that tightens regularly, a parent everyone adjusts around, a relationship where someone's mood dictates the climate. No one may call it abuse. No one may call it trauma. No one may even call it a problem. It may just be called family. And if you're a child inside that system, you're not comparing it to healthier alternatives. You're building yourself inside the only emotional architecture you know. So later, as an adult, you may still be drawn to what feels familiar rather than what is safe. You may tolerate things longer than other people understand. You may minimize intensity because it does not seem intense relative to what shaped you. You may excuse behavior that should have stopped you cold. You may confuse emotional volatility with honesty, chemistry, passion, closeness, or love. Not because you're foolish, because you were trained. That is a hard word, but I think it's true. Chaos trains us. It trains our threshold for what we call normal. It trains our bodies in what to expect. It trains our hearts in what to tolerate. And healing often begins with realizing that your baseline was built in a distorted room. Familiar is not the same as safe. But when you're raised inside of chaos, familiar can feel more convincing than safe. Because familiar is legible. You know how to read it. You know the cues. You know the shifts. You know how to anticipate it, survive it, accommodate it. Safe, on the other hand, can feel strange. Too quiet, too steady, too direct, too spacious, too calm. And if calm was not what shaped you, calm may not feel immediately trustworthy. I think a lot of us do not actually choose chaos consciously. We choose what our nervous systems recognize. We move towards what feels known. We explain away what echoes the past because some part of us still believes, if I understand the pattern, I can survive the pattern. And maybe we can. But survival is not the same as health. That is the shift. To realize that just because you can function inside a dynamic does not mean the dynamic is good for you. Just because you can explain someone does not mean their behavior is safe. Just because something feels familiar does not mean it belongs in your life. That kind of clarity usually comes slowly, and often painfully, because it asks you to mistrust what once felt normal. Chaos does not affect what we tolerate. It affects who we become. It teaches us roles. Maybe you become the peacemaker, maybe the manager, maybe the caretaker, maybe the invisible one, maybe the high achiever, maybe the one who always knows the emotional temperature of the room. And while those adaptations may help you survive, they can also follow you into adulthood in ways that cost you. You may have trouble resting, trouble trusting calm, trouble knowing when something is off versus when something merely feels familiar, trouble separating love from management, trouble staying rooted in your own feelings when everyone else's seem louder, but what it trained you to become. There is a question I think a lot of people ask themselves in healing. Why didn't I see it sooner? Why didn't I recognize that this was not okay? Why did I explain it away? Why did I tolerate it? Why did it take me so long to call it what it was? And I think part of that answer is this: because your nervous system had to be educated by earlier environments. Not educated toward clarity, educated toward adaptation. If you learned early that emotional pain was survivable, then later you may underestimate its cost. If you learned that adults say cruel things and that the family keeps moving, then later you may not immediately understand that words can be a deal breaker. If you learn that tension is normal, then peace may not register as necessary. This is not an excuse for harm. It is an explanation for confusion. An explanation matters, because shame is not useful here. Shame says, "How could you not know?" Compassion says, "Of course it took time. Look at what taught you what normal was." That is a very different posture. One keeps you stuck in self-blame. The other lets you begin to tell the truth. I think one reason these patterns are so hard to untangle is that the body often knows before the mind has language. You feel uneasy, tight, alert, embarrassed, protective, small, braced. You know something is off. But because it resembles what has always existed in some form, you do not necessarily interpret that feeling accurately. You may think, I am too sensitive. I am overreacting. This is not that bad. This is just stress. This is just family. This is just conflict. Meanwhile, your body is saying otherwise. That dinner table moment is one of those memories for me. I felt it. I felt the room change. I felt the ugliness of the sentence. I felt the impact on the people sitting there, especially the children. But full clarity did not arrive all at once. That is how healing often goes. First, the body reacts. Then, years later maybe, language catches up. And when it does, it can be unsettling, because then you realize how many things you felt without fully understanding, how much your body carried while your mind was still normalizing. How often you were already telling the truth, through tension, through vigilance, through discomfort, through exhaustion. The body often keeps the first record. Once you start seeing clearly, there's no easy way back. That is both painful and freeing. Painful because now you can see what was missing. You can see what was normalized. You can see what it cost you. You can see what it taught you to accept. Freeing because once something is named, it no longer gets to shape your life quite as invisibly. Healing, then, is not only about remembering the past, it is about reevaluating the template, asking different questions. What did I call normal that was actually harmful? What did I excuse because it was familiar? What roles did I learn to play in order to stay connected? What kind of conflict did I mistake for ordinary? What kind of peace still feels foreign to me? What do I need to relearn about love, safety, anger, repair, and honesty? These are not small questions, and they do not get answered once. They get answered over and over again in real life, in relationships, in parenting, in boundaries, in what you allow, in what you leave, in what you no longer explain away. So today's episode is really about one truth: that chaos can feel normal when it is what shaped you. And sometimes healing begins with a very simple sentence. That was familiar, but it was not normal. And it's not what I want to keep carrying forward. I remember a moment later in my life when I was in a completely different kind of environment. A disagreement came up, and the person I was with said, very calmly, "I didn't like how that felt. Can we talk about it?" No raised voices, no withdrawal, no tension building, just clarity. And I remember feeling something unexpected. Not relief, discomfort, almost like suspicion, like something was missing. What was missing was the chaos. That moment showed me something clearly. My nervous system didn't just recognize chaos, it expected it. This is something trauma research supports. The nervous system doesn't just store experiences, it builds expectations around them. So, we often move forward what feels familiar, not what is healthy. Chaos trains us. It trains our threshold for what we call normal. It trains our bodies in what to expect. it trains our hearts in what to tolerate. And healing often begins with realizing that your baseline was built in a distorted room. So I want to ask you something. Where in your life does familiar feel more convincing than safe? Where have you explained something away because it made sense, even if it didn't feel good? This week, notice your responses. Notice what your body trusts. Not what you think is right, but what feels recognizable. Does it feel calm, or does it feel activating? And gently ask yourself, is this familiar or is this safe? Because those are not the same thing. And learning that difference is part of healing. Healing is where your adult self begins interrupting what your child self had to normalize. Before we close, if this feels supportive, you can join me in a short grounding moment. Nothing complicated, just a pause. Because talking about what felt normal growing up can bring a lot into the room. And sometimes we don't even realize what's been stirred up in us until we pause. So if you're able, just slow down with me for a moment. If you're driving, keep your eyes open, but if it's safe to do so, you may want to close your eyes. Notice your body where you are. Notice the surface beneath you, the chair holding you, or your feet on the floor. Just let yourself feel supported. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently, not forcing it, not trying to change anything, just noticing that your body is breathing. Maybe take another breath, and this time, let your exhale be a little longer than your inhale, just a little. And if it feels okay, look around the space you're in. Notice something steady, a color, a shape, a familiar object, something that reminds your body that this moment is not the past. You might notice your shoulders. If they're tight, just let them soften a little. You might notice your jaw. If it's clenched, just let it loosen. No forcing, just allowing. And if something came up for you in this episode, a memory, a feeling, a realization, you don't have to push it away, and you don't have to hold it all right now either. You can just acknowledge it, gently, without needing to resolve it. And you might say to yourself quietly, I am here now. I am allowed to notice what I carry, and I do not have to carry it all at once. Just take one more breath. In the next episode, we're going to talk about what children carry when chaos is normal in the home, because children always absorb more than adults around them realize. If this resonates with you, this is the work I explore more deeply in my book, The Fan in the Window, how our nervous systems carry what we inherited and how we begin interrupting those patterns for the next generation. If this episode spoke to you, following the show and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts helps more people find it. Thank you for being here. This is The Fan in the Window, interrupting what we inherit. And we're just getting started. This didn't start with you, but you can interrupt it.